Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to take a look at another game that was played not by me, but by a friend of mine fairly recently in the amateur team tournament. So this was actually a game played in round 4, I think, and it was the team's third board, and we won the match, but this game wasn't so successful, though it started off really well. But it was just a very interesting game to me. And actually, the player on my team played better than I thought for most of the game, but kind of lost the thread in time trouble. So white is about a 1990, 2000 player, and black is quite a bit lower, but also I think only around 9 or 10 years old. So one of these scary youngsters on their way up, and well, we'll see. Played quite a good game, so it's a good battle, and the other guy came out on top. But anyway, I think it's just a very interesting game. So let's have a look. All right. So my teammate's white. We have a Ruy Lopez, open variation. Okay, and now there are several moves that can be played here. Knight b to d2 is perhaps the most popular nowadays. I'm not really sure. Yeah, knight b to d2 is the most common, slightly in Power Book. Bishop to e3 has sometimes been played. This is a more positional approach designed to impede black from playing bishop to c5, queen to e2 with the idea of rook to d1, and then c4 is an idea of Paul Kerres's. I don't know if he invented it, but it's named after him, so the Kerres variation. And then of course there's the other absolute main move, which is what was chosen in the game, c3. Okay, so here black played bishop to c5, which is a main move, knight b to d2, and here too there are any number of moves, but overwhelmingly the most common move here is to simply castle. All right, and okay, bishop to c2, and now black can choose between at least a couple of moves. So f5 is sometimes played, but the main moves, I should say, are knight takes f2, the so-called Dilworth variation, and then the other choice, main choice, is bishop to f5, which was played by Korchnoi, I think, fairly regularly in the 70s and 80s. All right, so instead of that, though, black played knight takes d2, and this is a slightly inferior move. I mean, it's surrendering the good knight without any especially good reason. So, okay, white took back with the queen, black castled, and all right, let's stop here a little bit and discuss this position and this opening and the main strategic, or some of the main strategic aims for both sides. All right, so white, of course, has a little bit more space, and it's primarily on the king side thanks to this pawn on e5. So that would at least generally suggest when you've got a majority, you want to get your majority rolling. And this is true, excuse me, this is true not only in an endgame, but often in a middle game as well. So if white can pull it off, he'd kind of like to get this f-pawn rolling. So f4, f5. Now how do we do it? Well, obviously we have to move the knight, and one place to move it to would be the d4 square. Okay, now that would also perhaps mean that the e-pawn is hanging. So a little bit of remaneuvering is going to have to take place for white. What can he do? I mean, some ideas might be to play something like queen f4, queen g3, then move the knight, and then play f4, f5. Another idea might be to play bishop c2, queen d3, attacking on this diagonal, and then play bishop f4, bishop g3, and then again move the knight, play f4, f5, and so on. So it'll take a little finagling here, but that would be one main idea. Okay, what is black up to? What's black's compensation for white's space advantage on the king side? Well, all of his pieces are on quite nice squares, so that's certainly something to feel good about for black. There aren't any problem pieces for him to worry about developing. He's got a decent central presence, and from here, some ideas besides just using the pieces to play are to get his own majority rolling. So black at some point might like to play c5. So that would involve moving the bishop and moving the knight. This knight can sometimes be well placed on e7. at least for temporary purposes, where, well, for one thing, it would help fight against this bishop c2, queen d3 plan, because then black can play bishop f5, or maybe in a pinch, knight to g6. All right, another idea for this knight is sometimes to go to a5, maybe from there to c4, though it can often just get kicked back, so bishop c2, queen d3, and then maybe b3 at some moment. All right, of course, this bishop also has to decide where it's going to go. Does it go to e7 to keep the g5 square under control? Or does it go to b6 to maintain this diagonal? Both of these ideas have their pluses and minuses as well. Also, another fundamental break for black to think about is f6. And this would certainly undermine white's pawn roller idea. So there, f4 in position after f6 has occurred is not really so attractive. So that's something else to think about. On the other hand, playing f6, it can have its drawbacks as well. So first of all, the d5 pawn would be hanging in a line after ef6, queen f6. Assuming the white queen is left d2, e takes f6, rook takes f6 would allow bishop to g5. So that's not so pleasant. And taking back with the pawn doesn't even come into consideration. So that has to be at least timed, but it is another possible idea for black. Okay, so we've mentioned some of black's plans, and we've also discussed some black ideas that can serve prophylactically, in other words, as preventive measures against some of white's ideas. Well, the reverse goes as well. So one thing that white might like to do is to try to prevent the c5 break from occurring. And there are a number of ways in which this might happen. So, for example, after bishop c2, queen d3, white might consider playing b4 and maybe bishop to e3. That would be one idea. Another idea might be to play knight to d4 and then knight to b3. So if white can get a really strong grip on the dark squares on the queen side, especially c5, then it might prove very difficult for black to gain any kind of counterplay anywhere. So white could potentially go for complete domination of the entire board. All right, so we'll see how this kind of works out in practice, but those are at least some ideas. And even here we can start to think, well, what's the best way for white to implement all of these plans? And one move that's, I think, pretty reasonable is simply queen to d3, getting unblocking the bishop on c1 and preparing bishop to c2. So one possible response would be queen to d7. And this, among other things, may make f6 a possibility. Okay, and now bishop to e3. So remember what I was saying before about white trying to maintain a grip on these dark squares on the queen side, especially c5. So takes and takes, and it actually looks pretty good for white at first glance. Okay, so black should probably play knight to a5. And here the idea would be that if white retreats this bishop to c2, then with knight to c4 and the threat to the b2 pawn, white has to give up either the pawn or control over c5. So to protect the pawn and as well as save the queen, he would have to go to c1. But actually, sorry, we'll look at one other possibility in a moment. If he goes to c1, then black plays c5, and then he should be in fine shape. So he's prevented knight to d4 and has achieved this nice pawn break. White might consider b4, but the drawback of something like this is that black has at least two things that are worth considering. So he could perhaps take, and then he has this potential passed pawn here. Well, it is a passed pawn, but potentially strong passed pawn. Maybe not just yet because of rook to d1, but it may move at some useful moment for him. Maybe he can play rook a to c8, something like that. All right, so that would be one idea. The second idea after b4 would be simply to jump on the file straight away, just like rook f to c8 maybe, and go for counterplay on the c file. Okay, I mentioned that white has another idea, so he could also play queen to d3 and simply ignore the threat because he's threatening checkmate on h7. So black will probably have to play g6. Don't really see any other obvious responses. But okay, still white has to deal with this pawn. So maybe b3, knight b6. Okay, no, yeah, knight a3 is sensible. And it also prevents white from playing queen to d4 or queen to e3. So black is still probably going to get in c5 here. All right, so interesting positions. Just shows again this kind of battle. It's not so easy to achieve white's strategic aim in this direct way. So another reasonable move for white here might be the kind of slow-looking h3. But a couple of things to note. So first of all, black might want to play bishop to g4 at some point, so it's not necessarily a bad prophylactic move. Secondly, white usually doesn't mind this exchange a whole lot. So knight takes b3, a takes b3, and now there's still that possibility of playing b4, let's say knight to d4, and here white could have a very serious advantage. So again, f4 is ready to go, and black's queenside is blockaded. His light square bishop isn't the best piece on the board by any stretch of the imagination. So I think white has superior chances here, slightly superior. And I would also say that here black probably should not make the exchange on b3. All right, so that's queen d3. The move chosen by white in the game, rook to d1, is not so bad. Okay, now here black played knight to e7, very natural move, protecting the pawn, preparing c6 if need be to free up the other pieces, and also supporting bishop to f5 at some moment if, let's say, white again tries this bishop c2, queen d3 approach. However, another idea is actually worth considering, which is f6. So I mentioned this before, and it looks like it's actually pretty okay. So ef, queen f6, and now white doesn't have to take on d5. In fact, queen to g5 might be the best move, trying to swap off some lumber here and get his queenside developed. If he plays bishop takes d5, then after rook a to d8, black has a pretty strong counterplay. So takes, say queen c2, queen f5. White, of course, cannot take on f5 because rook takes d1 is mating. So queen e2, takes, and then queen e4. And black has pretty good compensation here for the pawn. I mean, he's got an awful lot of activity. The reason for queen f5 is not just to grab the file and centralize, but also because he'd like to play knight to e5. But knight e5 right away would walk into queen to d5 check, winning a piece. So queen to e4 takes over the d5 square, and now knight to e5 is a threat. The point being that knight e5 and f2 falls. All right, so f6 I think would have been interesting. Not necessarily best, but interesting. Okay, so black played knight e7, bishop c2, knight to g6, and maybe this move deserves some censure as well. I'm not positive, but maybe playing c6 is better. Hard to say. All right, well here white again has a choice. So white played queen to d3 in the game, which is again sensible. It jumps onto this diagonal. The knight is more or less pinned here, and so white can consider not only knight to d4, but also even knight to g5. And then maybe h4, h5, among other things. So white has quite a few good options here. However, I think another reasonable way to proceed is with a4. So it's kind of funny. I mean, there's this kind of rule of thumb that, right, if you're strong on one side of the board, you focus there. But here white is, I think, again, well equipped to play on both sides. One idea behind a4 is that white wants to play b4, but would like to not allow a quick a5 from black in response. So a4 sets this pawn up first for that. So let's say c6, and now b4. Now a takes b5, takes, and rook e1. Overprotecting the e5 pawn. And I think white has an edge here. So again, black's queenside play is a little bit stymied. White is ready to make some progress here. Knight to g5, maybe queen g5, queen h5, and only then knight to g5 with good attacking chances. All right, so in the game, white played queen to d3. Black could consider f6 once again, especially now that the d pawn isn't even hanging. But he played c6. Okay, now here I have to give my teammate some credit. So he made a certain move here, and I thought, okay, it's not bad, but I thought he could have done even better. But it looks like he probably picked the best move. So definitely hats off to him. And actually, let me suggest that you guys stop the recording here and try to figure out what white's best way to proceed is. I mean, his position looks very promising, but it's maybe not as strong as it looks. I mean, it's not a bad position, and I think white is a little bit better, but my feeling during the game was that, oh, white must just be much better here, and it's really not quite that clear. So anyway, see what you can come up with based on your analysis, your experience, your best judgment based on the things that I said earlier. So put all of it together and see what you can find. Okay, long pause there, but yeah, I'm not pausing for the whole time you'll need to analyze. All right, well, let's look at some possibilities here. Now, one idea that I think should come to mind quickly is simply h4, with the idea of playing h5 and just blowing them off the board on the king side. Unfortunately, black simply plays bishop to g4, and he's actually in pretty decent shape. So this bishop is very well posted there. It's a real pain in the neck for white because of the pin, because it stops h5, and black is at least equal here. So that's a little too happy. Okay, well, another kind of related idea is knight to g5. So we get out of the way of this possible pin, and now maybe we are threatening h4, which could be quite serious because, okay, let's say it's white to move here. We play h4. Well, black can't play h6 now because knight e6, fe6, queen takes g6. Actually, yeah, maybe I'm a little too quick here because bishop takes f2 check. We can't go to the h file because of queen h4 mate. All right, king f1. Let's see. I think actually it's a dead end because all of white's guys are on light squares, but his king is not. Well, his king is, but it's going to have some problems. So let's say bishop to c5, king e2, rook f2 check maybe, king d3. Oh no, you can go to e1. Let's go to d3. So king e1. Well, queen h4. All right, not so pleasant. Okay, so maybe that's not such a big threat just yet. Anyway, let's see. All right, well, so that would be yet another problem that maybe this is not so clear here. But in any case, it's black's move here, and this doesn't even have to come up. So after knight to g5, bishop to g4 proves surprisingly disruptive. So hits the rook, f3 is illegal, and after rook to e1, now h6 is perfectly good. Knight f7 here is no good for a reason we just saw a moment ago. Rook f7, queen g6, bishop f2. Unhappy days for white. White's best is probably h3. Bishop to h5, but now it's just a dead end. The attack, knight f3, probably threatening g4 here, so bishop f3, queen f3, queen h4. Maybe white has a small edge here, thanks to the bishops. It's not great. I mean, and black is pretty active, but maybe again white has some chances for an edge here. All right. So going back to this position here, we've looked at h4 and we looked at knight to g5. h4 was bad. Knight to g5 was okay. Not spectacular, but all right. But what I was thinking, I believe, or one of the things I thought during the game was that maybe he should play b4 and go for the dark square domination idea that I had mentioned before. All right, so let's look at the possibilities. So if bishop to e7, keeping tabs on the g5 square, okay, then knight to d4. All right, if black plays queen to c4, which might be his best, white ignores the e-pawn and plays a4. And black's not really threatening to take because if queen takes e5, then there's knight c6, or if knight takes e5, blunder, queen h7 is mate. So I think white's better here. Queen to d7, I think white's even a little bit more than better, but it's a little bit tricky. So for example, if white goes for this plan of colonizing c5 in the name of democracy, it doesn't prove so easy. So bishop to e3, for instance, preparing knight to e3, knight to b3, and then maybe bishop c5, swap off these bishops, and then put the knight on c5, plant it, water it, and watch white's position grow? Well, it's not so fast. So a5. Okay, if knight to b3, black just wins the b pawn. So let's say a3. Okay, now f6. And black is kind of busting out all over here. He gets some counterplay. All right, so let's try inverting the order there. So instead of bishop to e3, let's try knight to b3 first, preventing a5. Well, what does black do now? Well, the answer is he should play the move that I said was prevented, a5. Very strong. So, again, there's a threat to take the b4 pawn. a3 is not very enterprising. And if knight takes a5, then black plays c5. And he gets pretty good counterplay. For instance, okay, let's say white plays a3, f6, e takes, bishop takes, bishop e3, trying to force the issue here. Okay, now rook f to c8, so that if bishop takes c5, then of course rook takes c5, and then rook takes a5. So white can play rook a to c1 here. Maybe he's got an edge, but black certainly has counterplay. So this is another very interesting position. It's playable for both sides, but certainly not that bad for black. Okay, so that was looking at knight to b3. So we tried bishop to e3, we tried knight to b3. Let's just forget about that and try to kill black. And that's in fact the best way to go. So f4. Threatening f5, winning a piece, because after knight takes e5, then f takes e6, and we win the piece. So we're going to take the queen next. Both sides get the queen, but white won a piece in the meanwhile. Okay, so black should play bishop to g4. Now rook e1, saving the rook and protecting the e5 pawn. So f5 followed by f6 is again a threat. Queen c7. And now maybe white has other good moves, but just a4 is actually quite strong, showing that white can play on the queen side as well. And this helps to impede black's own attempts at counterplay with c5. So white is clearly better in this position. All right. Does that mean that b4 is a panacea for white, that it cures everything? Unfortunately not. Instead of bishop to e7, black can play bishop to b6. And, okay, white has a choice. I think the best move is a4. So this prophylaxis against c5 possibilities first should be good for an edge. If we go back to this bishop to e3 plan here, then I think black still manages to equalize like this. So he takes, and now bishop to g4. So once again, activating the bishop, deactivating white's knight, and preparing either f6 or rook to e8. Either way, gaining some play on the king side. So this is about equal, actually. All right. So we've looked now at h4, not so good. Knight to g5, playable. b4, maybe only good for, no, with a4 instead of bishop to e3 and that one move, maybe white can get an edge too. A couple of other ideas that I'll just mention but not discuss are h3, prophylaxis against bishop to g4, and rook to e1, which is again kind of a double prophylactic move. So one is getting out of the way of a bishop to g4 pin or attack if the knight's moved, and secondly, protecting the e5 pawn. All right. Well, none of those moves are what were chosen in the game. That move was knight to d4. Again, very logical, thematic move. Okay, here too, black should play queen to c7, simply to give, well, 2 points. So one is, of course, the added pressure on the e5 pawn, and secondly, to give the bishop retreat squares if necessary. All right, so black played queen to d7, though. Okay, now here too, h4 is interesting, but black is okay. So bishop to g4, f3. Now we can do this because the knight on d4 breaks the possible pin. Bishop to h5. And now if g4, black can just make the sacrifice. And then with f6, black has an awful lot of play. White should play e6, but still after rook a to e8, black has 2 pawns. He's surely winning a third one. I mean, this h4 pawn is loose, the e6 pawn is threatened, and very unclear position. I would probably rather have black, but okay, before I guess I could say that with complete confidence. It would definitely require some analysis. All right, so after queen at d7, white played the more restrained bishop to e3. And again, I kind of like this because it's developing, it's further blocking this diagonal, so f4 becomes even simpler to play. And also there's the possibility, again, of playing, well, there are two possibilities. So there's the threat, first of all, of knight takes e6, which would just win the exchange. But there's also the positional threat of knight to b3, again followed by clamping down on c5. So black has a couple of possibilities here. He could play bishop to a7. In other words, he has to do something to either get the bishop off the diagonal or at least have it protected. So bishop to a7 takes care of the latter and prepares c5. So white played should play b4, and black too has to fight, so a5, and white should try to maintain this with a3. And I think white's got an edge here. So he's managed to prevent the c5 advance from happening under ideal circumstances. And again, he has the possibility of playing on both sides of the board. Black doesn't really have much by way of counterplay at the moment. So white has an edge. Instead of bishop to a7, though, black chose bishop to e7. Okay, so again, c5 is now on the agenda. And we can consider the move b4. All right, so c5 is unattractive, but a5 merits consideration. And now we could have an interesting variation. So f4, obvious threat, bishop to g4, getting out of the threat and creating one of his own. Rook d to b1, takes, and now what should black do? So it looks as if white has pretty much gotten everything he wants. c5 doesn't look possible, and white's going to slowly build up on the king side. Maybe play a3, and then knight to b3, followed by knight or bishop to c5. So quite a few things that white can consider here, and for that reason, black should play again very actively with c5. So takes, bishop takes, and now white cannot take on b5 because of knight takes f4. Oh no, I'm sorry. Let me think here. Let's stop and think for a moment. Okay, so if knight takes b5, what's wrong with this? Okay, knight f4 is certainly not the answer to that question. What do we do? Are there any good d4 tricks? Maybe d4. Maybe d4. Also, yeah, no. Okay, another idea is to play bishop f5. This might be simplest. Okay, so yeah, after bishop f5, queen f5, bishop e3, say king f1, takes, and then bishop f4. Okay, so if nothing else, there's at least this. And black's regaining the pawn with a good position. Maybe a very, very good position. Okay, so knight takes b5 is not so appealing. Queen takes b5, I think, is not going to work either. Just, if nothing else, black can keep taking things and then take on f4 at the end. So white's choices, I think, are either knight to b3, but, okay, takes, and then bishop f5. So black makes his own blockade, and even though he's got two queenside pawn weaknesses to white's one, his active play, his control of the light squares, and also white's pawns on the king side are a little bit overextended. So if, for example, we see something like this, all right, white has to worry about this pawn, and a move like g3 is creating even more weak squares over here. So black can consider, at some moment, not necessarily right here, but h5, trying to break this up. So I don't think white's doing especially brilliantly there. So maybe the right way to proceed here is rook to f1, switching back over to the king side, overprotecting the f4 pawn, probably with an edge. All right, so that's what happens here if white plays b4. In the game, white played f4, and this is perfectly good. And now, okay, if c5 here, white has another motif, which is to play knight f5. So we simply allow it, but now this knight is just a great piece. So takes, let's say queen c6, and now queen h3 should be clearly better for white. For one thing, he's got a big threat here. f5, let's say knight takes e5, and then f6, which hits the bishop, and carries with it a mate threat on h7. So I think this is a pretty nice position for white here. I think it's a clear advantage. So even without playing b4 or knight to b3 or any of that stuff, white has, at least for the moment, managed to prevent the c5 break. Okay, so black played queen to c7, and okay, and this allows him to meet f5 with knight takes e5, because now f takes e6 won't hit the queen. All right, so we've taken care of that little tactical problem. White could try bishop to f4 here. And this is actually kind of interesting, with the idea that if black retreats the bishop, now takes, f6, game over. Again, double attack on e7 and h7. However, black can play knight takes d3, bishop c7, and although black has two pieces under attack, this one and this one, he's got one pawn, and in fact now he's got two pawns, and he's hitting the rook on d1. So we can have this, say here, takes, c5, and surprisingly black just keeps this activity going and should be in pretty good shape. For instance, knight f5, bishop f6. So now we're aiming at this, and then the rook on a1 is going to be caught. So e7 here, bishop d8, threatening the queen. So takes, and kind of ironically or surprisingly, white really has no good way to defend this, because if rook to b3, then there's b4. So best to just give it up right away. Rook f1, bishop c3, rook a to d1, d4. And here we have a very peculiar position where black has 4 pawns for a rook, which normally is not a very good deal, but he's got such a strong presence in the center that the position is really very, very murky, and black may be in good shape. Also, g6, with the idea of following up with knight to e3, might prove really good for black. So, very interesting position. So f5 is possible, but probably white's choice was even better with queen to e2. And the idea of this is, again, it renews the threat of f5, it prevents bishop to g4, and the queen may come to h5 as well. So white is really playing a very nice game so far. Okay, now if black plays bishop to d7 here, getting out of the way of the fork, and preparing c5, well, now finally it looks like b4 is well timed. c5, and now, though I'm not taking, but knight to f5. All right, so this threatens to take on e7 and then take on c5. So let's say bishop f5, cb, cb, and still white has nice control over the dark squares. And bishop takes b4 is not so good because the d5 pawn is hanging. And then rook to d7 becomes something that black has to worry about as well. So queen c4 looks like a better idea. Queen f2. Now bishop b4, rook a to c1, bishop c3, bishop d3. And okay, white's down a pawn for the moment. Probably not for very long if he doesn't want to be. But his bishops are going to be very powerful. If the black queen retreats along the c file, bishop to d4 becomes a possibility. And there's always this f5 idea as well. So it's a very difficult position for black. White is clearly better here. So black chose c5. All right, now this is, again, obviously completely thematic. And it's just a question of how serious knight takes e6 is. So knight e6, f e6. And if the e6 pawn, well, okay, black has a couple of problems. So the e6 pawn is not always going to be a problem in this kind of position, but here it looks like it is a bit of a problem. And also, the fact that this g6 knight is less well supported is going to be a problem too. So white can play queen g4 or queen h5, and black is going to have some difficulties. And in fact, both of those moves are good. Queen g4 is good, but queen h5, which was played in the game, is also quite good as well. Now here, black could have played rook a to d8. Just a pawn sack takes, and white is better, but it's not 100% clear. But this is good for white. Okay, so black tried d4. He went for activity, and it worked out well. Now white has what's the well? Let me just ask, what's the best way for white to proceed here? So once again, let me challenge you guys to try to figure out what white's move ought to do here. Okay, so the move chosen in the game was the rather passive but stable bishop to d2. The best move was bishop takes g6. Okay, hg, queen g6. Okay, now black has to take, otherwise he's down a pawn and probably going to be down 2 pawns because he's either going to have to lose e6 or d4. So take the bishop, queen e6, and now if the king moves over, rook to d7 regains the piece with very big attack. So rook f7 is forced, rook d7, queen c8, queen d5. And black is fairly paralyzed here. All right, there's also a threat of rook takes e7. White has 2 pieces for the piece anyway. This e3 pawn is probably not long for the world if white really wants it. So this looks actually very good for white. For instance, king f8, e6, rook f6, and now rook e1. And I'm not sure that black can survive this ultimately. So I don't know, maybe c4 can be tried here, but black's position is very precarious. All right, so that's what I think white should have done. And had he thought of that, I mean, it's difficult, especially because he's been better, and now to be forced to sacrifice material is psychologically difficult. Especially again, you're playing this kid, you're higher rated, you've had the better position throughout the game. And these kinds of turning points can be really difficult to adjust to. So he played bishop to d2. Just figured, okay, I'll keep everything solid. My position's better. I'm the better player. Everything should be okay. But it proves not so simple anymore. Okay, so dc, bc, and now black plays a very good move here, c4. So this opens up this diagonal, which is quite a nice asset. It freezes this pawn on c3 and basically constipates white's whole queen side. And yeah, it's just white's position is deteriorated slightly. So he's probably still a little bit better with a move like king to h1, just getting out of the way of this diagonal, or maybe playing a4. He has reasonable play, but he chose instead bishop takes g6. So he figured, and again, this is the psychological situation at play here, that he has to kind of cash in. I mean, otherwise this whole attack was for nothing. All right, so queen check, good move, flicking that in first. Now he takes, and rook a to d8. And here, all of a sudden, black has very good compensation for the pawn. So yeah, he's down a pawn. The e6 pawn is slightly weak as well, but look at white's bishop. I mean, this bishop is just a pretty miserable piece. This pawn is rather weak. Of course, the f pawn is a little bit of a target, and it keeps the bishop on d2 shut out. And black could continue with things like rook to d3 and maybe rook e to d8, and just ratchet up the pressure on the b file. He could also try advancing his queenside majorities, another idea. And it's a little tougher to see what white is going to do here that's constructive, other than maybe beat a retreat here. Maybe play something like queen to e4 and try to play bishop to e3. Maybe that's an idea, though queen e4, rook to d3 prevents it. So it's not so easy for white to really find something constructive. So here he decided to just go full on for activity here, all out for it. So f5. E takes f5 is, of course, impossible because the queen's hanging. So rook takes f5, bishop h6, takes, bishop f8. Now, we'd like to play rook to d7, but rook to f1 mate is kind of a problem. So h3. And now here, black missed a nice chance. So see if you can figure out what black should do in this position. Okay, well, thinking prophylactically, it may be clear that what white wants to play is rook to d7. So white would love to put his rook on the square and then have a little sacrificing party on g7, which culminates with checkmate. So queen to c7, from that perspective, is a pretty sensible move. The only drawback is the obvious one. It hangs the e6 pawn. But let's look. Queen f7. Okay, because of the threat to the bishop now, white has to trade queens. So takes, takes. And now wherever the bishop goes, let's say d2, black grabs the e-pawn, reestablishes material equality, but has a much better position. His queenside pawns are far more dangerous than white's kingside majority. The c3 pawn is a fixed target. Black's king is better centralized. So this is a significantly better position for black all of a sudden. Okay, so that's what black should have played here after h3. Instead he played a5, which is an inaccurate move. And now white still has a chance to stay in the game. So see if you can figure out what white's move ought to do. So the position becomes actually pretty, it still has some life in it, and white is still okay if he plays correctly. Okay, well, I think white has two reasonable moves here. One is to play king h2. This is what I had expected, and actually my teammate just completely missed this. And he actually thought for quite a while here. So I was really surprised when he told me that he didn't see this. I guess he had just kind of blacked out or had been a bit discouraged by the turn that the game had taken. But king h2, simply getting out of the way of rook f1 check stuff so the rook can come up, is quite sensible. So here black should probably play rook to f7. And now, again, it seems as if white is in pretty good shape. Like he should be able to just lift the rook over, so like rook d4, rook h4, move the bishop and give mate. So some idea like this. But again, it proves a little bit difficult, even though it's not immediately evident where black's play comes from. So let's watch and see. So if rook to d4, what does black do? Well, the answer is queen c7. So this is kind of annoying. So if, for example, rook to h4, then queen e5 check can be played, bishop f4, queen f5. And h7 is covered just in the nick of time. Actually, that's kind of silly. We just play rook takes f4, even better, and white can resign here. So either way, black is completely fine and up material. So let's suppose white plays bishop to f4, maybe hoping to play bishop g3 and then rook h4. Okay, will this work? We know the answer. Bishop to c5. Okay, he's got to play rook to e4. And now queen c6. And, okay, the e6 pawn is protected. Black's king can always run out to f8 and e7. So it's just not quite working for white here. I mean, he's still in the game, but black has everything covered, and he's a bit better. And white has to be much more careful about black's queenside pawns than black has to be about anything white's doing on the king side at the moment. All right. So this direct approach with rook to d4 doesn't work. Okay, how about bishop to g5? Again, the idea of rook d4, rook h4. What does black do this time? Well, here, there are a few things he can play. We'll just give one main variation. So b4, rook to d4. Here we come. b3, rook h4. Okay, so we're giving white everything he wants. Doesn't matter. Rook f1, check, here, check. Okay, black can retreat with an immediate draw, or he can play g6, and this is a draw too. Check here, rook to d4, threatening rook to d7 check, so queen b5, preventing that and also threatening the e5 pawn, bishop f6, rook f6, ef6, queen check, king here, take this, check here, trade pawns, and now rook to b7. And black is okay, but really can't do anything about the threat of rook b8, rook b7, b8, b7. So queen c3, and it's perpetual. So white is still equal here, thanks to black's inaccurate previous move, but black is okay too. All right, so that was what happens on this prophylactic move, king h2, getting off the back rank. But it turns out that white can actually play rook to d7 straight away. even without that, because after rook f1 and queen g1, there's nothing further. Queen e3 is covered by the bishop on h6, and the rook has no safe checks, and black also has no good defense to the threat of rook takes g7. So he's got to play queen f2, and then here there's nothing better than just repeating. So that would have been an immediate draw as well. So unfortunately, my pal played rook to e1, and now he goes downhill fast. So b4, here they come. Bishop e3, queen c6, bishop d4, b3. And it's bad times for my teammate here. a4, bishop e7. So now the threat is rook to g5, hitting the queen, well, and of course threatening the mate as well. White can play queen e4, but that's not much fun. So queen g4, just getting out. Queen takes a4, queen e4, queen b5, queen checks, rook back, queen a7, bishop g5, everything's covered. White has no attack. Bishop c5, rook to d8, rook f1, queen d7, queen a5, queen d3, rook f3, and now the last move of the game, which forced immediate resignation, was b2. And painful finish for white here. So the point, of course, is that after b2, rook takes d3, black just queens with check, and after king h2, queen takes d3. Everything's covered. Black's got an extra rook, and that's enough to win the game. So not a bad game at all. Very interesting. I think very instructive in terms of all the open ruling motifs that we saw in conflict there. So I hope it was an instructive game for you. Certainly, if you play either side of the Ruy Lopez, or I should say the open Ruy Lopez, there's a good chance that it'll have provoked some worthwhile thoughts. But you'll have to let me know. So thank you very much. Again, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.